They laughed when Samantha Reed inherited an old cabin buried deep in the West Virginia mountains. To her family, it was worthless. But beneath those dusty wooden floors, Samantha discovered a hidden room and a secret her grandmother had protected for decades. Inside was a forgotten collection worth more than $2 million. But as Samantha would soon discover, the money wasn't the real reason her grandmother had chosen her. And that truth would change everything. Keep watching and subscribe if you believe every forgotten place has a story. The morning fog hung low over the Appalachian Hills as Samantha Reed drove into Maple Ridge, West Virginia. At 39, she knew every bend in that narrow mountain road. Though she hadn't called this place home in nearly 14 years. Some places don't leave you simply because you leave them. Maple Ridge was one of those places. The white church at the edge of town looked smaller than Samantha remembered. She parked her aging silver Ford beneath a bare maple tree and sat behind the wheel for a moment, gathering the courage to go inside. Her grandmother, Evelyn Reed, was waiting there. Not the woman Samantha remembered, the woman who made strong coffee before sunrise, patched worn quilts by hand, and somehow knew when Samantha was hurting without asking a single question. That Evelyn was gone. She had died peacefully 3 nights earlier at 87. Samantha pulled her black coat tighter and walked toward the church. A few relatives nodded when they saw her. Others offered thin smiles. Some simply watched. She recognized those looks. To them, Samantha was still the quiet one. The woman whose marriage hadn't lasted. The woman who'd left Maple Ridge hoping for something bigger and returned without the kind of success people like to talk about at family gatherings. She had spent years wondering whether they were right about her. Evelyn never had. When Samantha was a child, the two of them spent summer evenings on the porch of an old cabin high in the mountains. Evelyn would sit in her wooden rocker while Samantha curled beneath a faded quilt, listening to cicadas and the distant creek. One evening, after Samantha came home crying because other children had called her strange for being so quiet, Evelyn took her hand. The loudest person in the room rarely hears what matters most, she said. Samantha never forgot those words. But standing in that church 14 years later, surrounded by people who still seemed to see everything she had failed to become, she wasn't sure she believed them anymore. Then the funeral began, and as Samantha watched her grandmother's casket disappear beneath the cold November earth, she couldn't have known that Evelyn had left behind one final message for her, or that before the sun went down. The same relatives who barely looked at Samantha that morning would be laughing at her inheritance. They thought Evelyn had left her the least valuable thing she owned. They had no idea she had left Samantha the one thing she'd spent decades protecting. The reading of Evelyn Reed's will was scheduled for 3 that afternoon. By then, the November sky over Maple Ridge had turned the color of old steel. Samantha followed her relatives into a small law office just off Main Street, above a hardware store that had been there since she was a child. The narrow stairway smelled faintly of dust and floor wax, and somewhere downstairs, an old bell jingled every time a customer opened the store door. Inside the conference room, 12 members of the Reed family gathered around a long walnut table. Samantha took the last empty chair near the window. No one asked her to sit closer. Her Uncle Richard sat across from her, checking his watch. Beside him, Aunt Diane whispered something to her daughter Emily, who covered a smile with one hand. Samantha looked away. She had learned years ago that sometimes dignity meant refusing to ask what people were laughing about. A few minutes later, the family attorney, Henry Caldwell, entered carrying a thick folder. Henry was 72, with silver hair and the slow, careful manner of a man who had spent most of his life delivering news people didn't always want to hear. He adjusted his glasses. Evelyn was very specific about how she wanted this handled. He said. The room became quiet. For the next 20 minutes, Evelyn's possessions were distributed one by one. A savings account went to Richard. Her jewelry was divided between Diane and two nieces. Her Buick went to a grandson who had occasionally driven her to medical appointments. An antique grandfather clock went to Emily. With each announcement came small nods of satisfaction. Then Henry turned another page. He paused. Samantha noticed it. To my granddaughter, Samantha Reed, he read, I leave all rights and ownership to the property located approximately 11 miles north of Maple Ridge, including the cabin, surrounding acreage, and all contents therein. For 1 second, nobody spoke. Then Richard laughed. Not loudly at first. Just a short, disbelieving chuckle. The mountain cabin. Emily looked at her mother. You mean that old place is still standing? A few people laughed. Someone near the end of the table muttered, Hope she likes mice. Richard leaned back in his chair. Well, Sam, he said, smiling, looks like you've got yourself a fixer-upper. More laughter. Samantha felt the familiar heat rise beneath her collar. For years, she would have lowered her eyes. Maybe even smiled along with them, pretending the joke didn't hurt. This time, she simply looked at Richard. Then she looked at Henry. Is that all she asked? Something in her voice made Richard's smile fade slightly. Henry studied her for a moment. That is what the will states. Samantha nodded, and strangely, she wasn't disappointed. Because she knew that cabin. When she was a little girl, Evelyn had taken her there every summer. They picked blackberries along the creek. They drank coffee milk and sugar for Samantha from chipped enamel cups on the porch. Evelyn taught her how to split kindling, mend a torn shirt, recognize an approaching storm by the smell of the air. The rest of the family hated the place. Too remote. Too cold. No television reception. But Samantha remembered something else. Peace. And Evelyn. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Chairs scraped against the floor as everyone stood. Conversations immediately turned toward appraisals, bank accounts, and what people planned to do with what they'd received. Richard stopped beside Samantha on his way out. If you decide you don't want that place, he said, somebody might give you a few thousand for the land. Samantha looked up at him. I think I'll keep it. Richard shrugged. Suit yourself. Then he left. Soon, Samantha was alone with Henry Caldwell. She reached for her coat. Samantha. Something in Henry's voice stopped her. He waited until the conference room door clicked shut. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small, cream-colored envelope. I was instructed not to mention this while the others were present. Samantha slowly sat back down. Henry placed the envelope on the table. Her name was written across the front. Samantha. She recognized the handwriting immediately. Her grandmother's. The sight of it hurt more than the funeral had. For a moment, Samantha could see Evelyn's hands again, thin and spotted with age, holding a pen at the kitchen table, carefully writing birthday cards she never forgot to send. When did she give you this? Samantha whispered. 6 months ago. Henry pushed the envelope toward her. She made me promise it would go only to you. After the will was read. After everyone else had gone. Samantha picked it up. There was something inside besides paper. Something small. Hard. Perhaps a key. Her heart began beating faster. What did she say? Henry hesitated. Then his expression softened. She said you'd understand when you were ready. Outside the window. Samantha watched Richard and the others climb into their cars. They were still laughing. still talking about the worthless cabin Evelyn had left behind. Samantha looked down at the envelope in her hands. Suddenly, she remembered one summer evening nearly 25 years earlier. She and Evelyn had been sitting on the cabin porch when Samantha asked why her grandmother refused to sell the place. Evelyn had stared toward the mountains for a long time before answering. Because some things lose their value the moment you put a price on them. At 14, Samantha hadn't understood. Now those words returned with unsettling clarity. She slipped the envelope carefully into her coat. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Where are you going?" Samantha stopped at the door. For the first time that day, something almost like a smile touched her face. "To see what Grandma left me." Less than 20 minutes later, her silver Ford was climbing the old mountain road. The envelope rested unopened on the passenger seat. And 11 miles ahead, hidden among the trees, stood the cabin everyone had laughed about. Waiting for her, the road to the cabin was narrower than Samantha remembered. Her silver Ford climbed slowly through the West Virginia mountains, tires crunching over loose gravel as the last light of afternoon slipped behind the ridgeline. Bare branches reached over the road, and every few miles Samantha passed something she remembered: a rusted mailbox, an abandoned barn, the little creek where Evelyn once taught her to skip stones. It felt strange how a place could remain inside you even after 14 years away. By the time Samantha reached the clearing, evening had settled over the woods. The cabin stood exactly where memory had left it. Small, weathered, leaning slightly toward the mountain. One shutter hung crooked beside the front window. The porch railing needed repair, and Evelyn's old wooden swing moved gently in the November wind. Samantha turned off the engine. For a while, she simply stared. Her family had seen a worthless building. Samantha saw summer mornings, blackberry stains on her fingers, rain against a tin roof, her grandmother humming while making biscuits. She stepped onto the porch and unlocked the door with the old key Henry Caldwell had given her with the property papers. The hinges groaned. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, dust, and cold stone. Almost nothing had changed. The faded quilt was still folded over the couch. An enamel coffee pot rested beside the stove. Evelyn's old rocking chair faced the fireplace as though she might return at any moment and ask Samantha why she'd taken so long. That nearly broke her. Samantha touched the back of the chair. "I miss you, Grandma," she whispered. Only the wind answered. She built a small fire before darkness completely swallowed the windows. Then she sat in Evelyn's chair and finally removed the envelope from her coat. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. A small brass key fell into her palm. Then Samantha unfolded the letter. There were only a few lines. "My dear Samantha, if you're reading this, then you came back. People have always mistaken your quietness for weakness. I never did." Samantha stopped. Her eyes filled before she could prevent it. She continued, "This cabin has held our family's memories longer than anyone living remembers. I kept them because someone had to. If you still remember how to listen, start with the floor. You'll know where. Love, Grandma." Samantha read the last sentence twice. Then 3 times. Start with the floor. For several minutes, she heard nothing but the fire. And then a childhood memory returned. She was 9 years old, crawling across these same floorboards while Evelyn made supper. Samantha had been tapping the boards with a wooden spoon, pretending they were piano keys. Most made the same dull sound. But near the fireplace, one had sounded hollow. Samantha stood. Her heartbeat quickened. An old braided rug covered that corner now. She pulled it aside. Dust rose into the firelight. At first, there was nothing unusual. Then she saw it. A faint, rectangular seam cut into the wooden floor, and at its center was a small brass lock. Samantha looked down at the key in her hand. No way! She knelt. The key slid into the lock perfectly. One turn, a soft click. Samantha pulled on a recessed iron ring, and a section of floor lifted with a long wooden groan. Cold air rose from beneath the cabin. There were stairs. She grabbed a flashlight from her car and returned. Every sensible part of her said to wait until morning. She went down anyway. 7 narrow steps led into a stone-walled chamber. Her flashlight moved slowly across wooden shelves. Boxes, metal cases, stacks of carefully wrapped documents. Then the beam caught something that flashed gold. Samantha stepped closer. Coins. Dozens of them. Some were sealed in protective sleeves. Others rested inside velvet-lined cases, each labeled in Evelyn's handwriting. On another shelf were military medals, old photographs, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, U.S. savings bonds, a wooden box marked 1944. Samantha forgot to breathe. This wasn't forgotten junk. Someone had preserved everything deliberately, carefully, lovingly. She opened one of the boxes. Inside lay a tarnished military medal and a black and white photograph of a young man in uniform. Beneath them was a letter. Samantha unfolded it. The first line began, "Dear Mama, if this reaches you before I do." She couldn't continue. Suddenly, the objects surrounding her no longer felt like objects. They belonged to people. People who had loved someone, waited for someone, lost someone. At the far end of the shelf, Samantha noticed a thick, leather-bound book. She opened it. The first entries dated back generations. Names, dates, locations, descriptions. It was a catalog. A family archive? Samantha slowly turned the pages until she reached handwriting she recognized. Evelyn's. Near the back, one sentence had been underlined twice. Not everything is beneath this house. Samantha stared at it. Above her, the cabin creaked in the mountain wind. Her family thought Evelyn had left her a worthless cabin. But Samantha now understood something they didn't. The cabin wasn't the inheritance. It was the doorway, and whatever Evelyn had spent decades protecting. Samantha had only found the beginning. For a long while, Samantha didn't move. She sat on an old wooden crate beneath the cabin, the leather ledger open across her knees, while the beam from her flashlight rested against shelves filled with nearly a century of memories. Upstairs, the fire crackled faintly. Down here, time seemed to have stopped. Samantha turned another page. Each entry had been written with remarkable care. A date, a name, where the item had come from, and sometimes a story. Silver dollar, 1945, carried home by Thomas Reed after the war. He kept it in his left breast pocket because his wife told him he'd better bring himself and the coin back to West Virginia. Samantha smiled through the tears gathering in her eyes. Another entry described a military medal belonging to a young man named Walter Collins. He wasn't even a Reed. According to the ledger, Walter had grown up 2 farms away and left for Europe at 19. He never came home. His mother had given the medal to Samantha's great-grandfather because she couldn't bear to throw it away, but couldn't stand to look at it either. Samantha stared at the medal for a long time. Her relatives upstairs in Henry Caldwell's office had talked about value as if it could always be written on a check. But what was this worth? What was a mother's grief worth? What was the last photograph of a 19-year-old son worth? There were no numbers for things like that. She kept reading. Hours passed without her noticing. Eventually, Samantha found entries written in Evelyn's hand. They were more personal. Besides certain names, her grandmother had added small details. Loved peach pie. could play any hymn by ear, never learned to swim, afraid of thunderstorms but wouldn't admit it. Those little sentences hurt Samantha more than anything else. Evelyn hadn't preserved history as a list of important dates. She had preserved people. Samantha closed her eyes. All her life, being quiet had felt like a flaw she needed to overcome. At family dinners, louder voices interrupted her. During her marriage, her former husband had often accused her of thinking too much. Even at work, people sometimes mistook patience for uncertainty. Eventually, Samantha had begun believing them. Maybe she really was too hesitant, too ordinary, too easily forgotten. Then she remembered Evelyn's letter. People have always mistaken your quietness for weakness. I never did. Samantha lowered her head. A tear fell onto her hand. For the first time, she wondered whether the very thing she'd spent years trying to change was the reason Evelyn had trusted her. Maybe her grandmother hadn't given her the cabin because there was nothing better left. Maybe she'd given it to Samantha because she knew Samantha would stop long enough to listen. That thought followed her upstairs. It was nearly midnight. Samantha added another log to the fire, made coffee in Evelyn's old enamel pot, and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger in front of her. The cabin no longer felt abandoned. Every scratch in the floor seemed connected to someone. Every photograph downstairs belonged to a life. Every handwritten note seemed to whisper the same thing. Remember us. Samantha looked toward Evelyn's empty rocking chair. Is that why you chose me? She whispered. There was no answer. But somehow, for the first time in years, Samantha didn't need one immediately. The next morning, she began working. She carried boxes carefully into better light, photographed labels, created an inventory on her laptop, and matched names in the ledger with letters and photographs. She handled everything as though someone's grandmother might walk through the door and ask what she had done with their memories. By afternoon, Samantha had catalogued only a fraction of one shelf, and she had never felt more certain about anything. Then her phone rang. Aunt Diane. Samantha almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Samantha. Honey. Diane began when she answered. I was wondering how things are up at that old cabin. The sweetness in her voice felt unfamiliar. Fine. Well, your grandmother kept things, you know. Old coins, papers, family keepsakes. Samantha's eyes moved toward the hidden hatch. Diane continued, if you happen to find anything valuable, I'm sure you'll remember it belongs to the family in a way. We should all have a chance to discuss it. There it was. The old Samantha might have apologized. She might have promised to think about it, just to avoid conflict. Instead, Samantha looked at Evelyn's letter lying beside the ledger. Grandma left the cabin and everything inside it to me. Silence. Then Diane laughed nervously. Of course. I'm only saying. I know what you're saying. Samantha's voice wasn't angry. That surprised even her. It was calm. Steady. I'll make sure what's here is protected. She ended the call. For several seconds, Samantha stared at the phone. Then something unexpected happened. She smiled. Not because she had won anything, but because she had finally heard her own voice without apologizing for it. That evening, Samantha opened the ledger to a blank page. She picked up a pen. Her handwriting looked different beside Evelyn's, but that was all right. She wrote, November 18th. Today I began cataloging the lower shelves. Then she hesitated before adding one more line. I don't know yet why Grandma chose me, but I'm beginning to understand. Samantha closed the book. She thought that was enough for one day. She didn't yet know that hidden among Evelyn's papers was an old appraisal document. And when Samantha found it, she would finally understand why her relatives had suddenly become so interested in what was inside the cabin. Because the history beneath her feet wasn't merely priceless in the sentimental sense. Some of it had a very real price. And that number was going to change everything. By the end of her first week at the cabin, Samantha had settled into a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. She woke before sunrise, made coffee in Evelyn's old enamel pot, and watched the fog lift slowly from the Appalachian hills. Then she went downstairs. Hour after hour, Samantha cataloged photographs, letters, medals, coins, and documents. She learned names she'd never heard at family dinners. She read about marriages that survived wars, sons who never came home, and ordinary people who had lived quiet lives that mattered deeply to someone. For the first time in years, Samantha didn't wake wondering what she was supposed to do with her life. She already knew. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, she found the envelope. It had been tucked inside the ledger between two pages dated nearly 15 years earlier. Across the front, in Evelyn's handwriting, were 3 words. Private appraisal records. Samantha opened it. The first page contained a list of items and estimated values. She read the numbers once. Then again, a rare gold coin, $38,000. A collection of historic U.S. silver dollars, $130,000. Military medals and documented wartime memorabilia, $74,000. Unredeemed savings bonds, $340,000. Several rare coin lots, nearly $900,000. Her eyes moved toward the bottom. Partial estimated value, $1,862,000. Samantha stopped breathing for a moment. Almost $2 million. And the appraisal was years old. She looked toward the hidden room. Suddenly, those shelves seemed different. Not more important, just more dangerous. The next morning, Samantha called the name listed on the appraisal. Samuel Bennett, Historical Collections and Numismatics. A man answered after 3 rings. When Samantha mentioned Evelyn Reed, silence followed. Evelyn, he finally said. You're her granddaughter. Yes. Samuel exhaled softly. I wondered who she'd choose. The words caught Samantha off guard. Choose. But Samuel moved past the question. He remembered the collection well. Evelyn had refused every suggestion that she sell even a small part of it. She told me something once. Samuel said, money changes hands. History disappears. Samantha smiled. That sounded exactly like her grandmother. Samuel agreed to come the following afternoon. He arrived in an older dark green pickup, carrying 2 leather cases and wearing wire-rimmed glasses. At 68, he moved carefully. But the moment Samantha opened the hidden hatch, something changed in his face. He descended the stairs. For nearly an hour, Samantha barely heard him speak. Occasionally there was a quiet whistle. Once she heard, my goodness. When Samuel finally came upstairs, he removed his glasses and sat at the kitchen table. Samantha poured him coffee. Well, she asked. Samuel looked toward the floor. Your grandmother preserved that collection better than some museums preserve theirs. He explained that several coins had increased significantly in value. Some documents had strong historical provenance. A few items required authentication, but the collection was larger than the old appraisal reflected. Samantha tightened both hands around her coffee mug. How much? Samuel hesitated. If I had to estimate today, he leaned back. More than $2 million. The room became very quiet. Samantha thought she might feel excitement. Instead, she thought of Evelyn sitting alone at this same table. All those years, knowing what lay beneath her feet, never selling it, never boasting about it, never using it to make people treat her differently. Why didn't she sell? Samantha asked. Samuel smiled faintly. Because your grandmother didn't think she owned those things. Samantha looked at him. She thought she was keeping them for whoever came next. The words settled heavily in Samantha's chest. Not owning, keeping. Before Samuel left, he asked to examine one final wooden case. Inside was a tarnished brass compass Samantha had barely noticed. Samuel turned it over. His expression changed. What is it? He pointed to a tiny symbol scratched into the back, a sycamore leaf surrounded by a circle. I saw this downstairs. They returned to the ledger. After several minutes, Samuel found the same symbol beside an entry from 1953. There was no description of money, no inventory number, only a sentence. Original creek line. Follow the sycamore marker to where the first Reed cabin stood. Samantha felt a chill move across her arms. The first cabin. Samuel looked at her. You didn't know there was another one. Samantha slowly shook her head. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Samuel closed the ledger. Then I'd say your grandmother still has something to tell you. After he drove away, Samantha stood alone on the porch. $2 million. A week earlier, her family had laughed because she'd inherited an old mountain cabin. Now Samantha knew she could sell part of what lay beneath it and change her life overnight. Pay off every debt. Buy a new home. Never worry about money again. But for the first time, wealth didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a question. What was she supposed to do with something generations of people had trusted one another not to destroy? Samantha looked toward the darkening woods. Somewhere beyond those trees was a sycamore marker. And perhaps the answer. Then her phone buzzed. A message from Uncle Richard. We need to talk about what you found in Grandma's cabin. Samantha stared at the screen. She had told no one. Not about Samuel. Not about the appraisal. Not about the 2 million. Yet somehow, her family knew. And suddenly, the secret beneath the cabin didn't feel hidden anymore. The message from Uncle Richard stayed on Samantha's phone for nearly 10 minutes. We need to talk about what you found in Grandma's cabin. She read it again. Standing alone in Evelyn's kitchen, while the last gray light disappeared behind the mountains. Samantha had told no one. Samuel Bennett had promised discretion. Henry Caldwell knew only what the will contained. Yet somehow, less than 24 hours after the appraisal, Richard knew there was something worth discussing. She didn't answer. The next morning, Aunt Diane called. Samantha, honey, I've been thinking about you. That alone told Samantha something was wrong. Diane had barely spoken to her at the funeral. It must be overwhelming, she continued. Being alone up there with all of Grandma's things. I'm managing. Well, Richard mentioned there may be some family valuables in the cabin. Samantha looked toward the rug covering the hidden hatch. Did he? Diane hesitated. I just think we should remember that those things belong to our family long before they belonged to you. There it was again. Our family. A week earlier, the cabin had been Samantha's problem. Now it was our history. I'll keep that in mind, Samantha said. By Sunday, 3 more relatives had called. One suggested selling the coins and dividing the money. Another offered to find an auction house. Richard was less polite. You really think Grandma meant for you to keep $2 million to yourself? Samantha's stomach tightened. So they knew the number. This isn't about $2 million. Richard laughed. People only say that when they're the ones holding the money. Years ago, that sentence would have silenced her. Instead, Samantha looked at Evelyn's ledger on the kitchen table. No, she said quietly. Sometimes people say it because they finally understand what the money is attached to. Richard went silent. Then his voice hardened. You don't get to decide what happens to our family history. Samantha surprised herself with her answer. Grandma decided who would protect it. She ended the call. Her hands were trembling, but she hadn't apologized. That mattered. Over the following days, Samantha became more careful. She photographed every item and created digital copies of the ledger. She moved the most fragile documents into protective sleeves and installed a stronger lock on the cabin door. Then she began noticing things. Boot prints near the woodpile that weren't hers. Tire tracks at the end of the gravel road. One night, headlights appeared between the trees and remained there for several minutes before disappearing. Samantha stood behind the curtain, heart pounding. For the first time, the cabin felt vulnerable. The next morning, she drove into town and bought motion lights and new locks. She hated doing it. Evelyn's cabin had always been the one place where doors didn't need locking. But Samantha was beginning to understand something Evelyn must have learned years ago. Some things become harder to protect the moment other people discover their price. 2 days later, Henry Caldwell called. His voice was unusually serious. "Samantha, I thought you should know. A few members of the family have contacted another attorney." Her heart sank. "They're contesting the will." "Not yet. They're asking questions. Whether Evelyn was competent. Whether the contents of this cabin were intended to be included with the property." Samantha looked around the room. Evelyn's coffee pot. Her rocking chair. The faded quilt. Suddenly, Samantha was angry. Not because they wanted money. Because people who had rarely visited Evelyn while she was alive were now questioning whether the old woman had understood her own decisions. "Was she competent?" Samantha asked. Henry almost laughed. "Your grandmother corrected a spelling mistake in the will 10 minutes before she signed it." Despite everything, Samantha smiled. "That sounds like her." "It does." Henry paused. "And Samantha?" "Yes." Evelyn documented everything. After the call ended, Samantha went downstairs. She sat among the shelves and opened the ledger. For days, she had wondered whether she deserved this responsibility. Now she understood that deserving it wasn't the question. Evelyn had trusted her. That was enough. Samantha turned to the entry Samuel had shown her. Original creek line? Follow the sycamore marker to where the first Reed cabin stood. She remembered seeing an old sycamore near the western edge of the property. That afternoon, she pulled on her boots and followed the overgrown trail behind the cabin. Branches caught at her coat as she walked. After nearly half a mile, she found it. A massive sycamore stood beside a dry creek bed. Nailed into its trunk was a rusted metal marker bearing the same symbol engraved on the old compass. Samantha touched it. Beyond the tree, almost hidden beneath decades of leaves, a narrow path continued deeper into the woods. For a moment, she considered turning back. Then she thought of herself at 9 years old, crying on Evelyn's porch because the world had told her quiet meant weak. She thought of 39-year-old Samantha standing in that kitchen and telling Richard no. Maybe courage didn't always arrive loudly. Maybe sometimes it was simply taking one more step when nobody else understood why. Samantha followed the path. She didn't know what waited at the end, but she knew something else now. She was no longer protecting the cabin because it was worth $2 million. She was protecting it because Evelyn had trusted her with something money could never replace. And for the first time in Samantha Reed's life, being chosen didn't frighten her. It gave her strength. Ahead, through the bare trees, she saw the remains of an old stone foundation, and resting beside it was something that made her stop. A weathered wooden box. On its lid were 2 faded words. For the keeper. Samantha stood beneath the old sycamore, staring at the wooden box. For the keeper. For several seconds. She couldn't bring herself to touch it. All week. She'd been surrounded by things that had survived people coins, medals, photographs, letters written by hands long since buried. But this felt different. This felt as though Evelyn had known Samantha would eventually stand in this exact place. She knelt beside the stone foundation. The box wasn't locked. Inside, Samantha found no gold, no rare coins, no bonds, just letters, dozens of them. Some were nearly a century old. Others had been written by Evelyn herself. Beneath them lay photographs of a cabin Samantha had never seen, the original Reed home that once stood beside the creek. One photograph showed a family gathered on the porch. Someone had written their names on the back. Samantha recognized only one. Her great-grandfather. He was 12 years old. She sat against the cold stones and began reading. The letters told of men leaving for war, women keeping farms alive through impossible winters, children born during hard years, and families surviving losses no one talked about anymore. There were no million-dollar treasures here. Only lives, and somehow, that made the box feel heavier. Near the bottom, Samantha found a page in Evelyn's handwriting. Every generation needs someone willing to remember. Not someone who wants to own the past. Someone willing to carry it. Samantha swallowed hard. Below those words was a list of names. Her great-grandfather. Her grandfather. Evelyn. Each separated by decades. Beside every name were two words. The keeper. The final line was blank. Samantha understood. Evelyn hadn't merely left her property. She had left her a place in a story that began long before she was born. Samantha took out a pen. For a moment, her hand hovered over the page. Then she wrote, "Samantha Reed, the keeper." She cried after that. Not loudly. There was no one there to hear her. She cried for Evelyn, for the 14 years she'd stayed away, for the marriage that had convinced her she was difficult to love, for every family dinner where she'd made herself smaller so other people could feel bigger. And she cried because the woman she loved most had apparently spent years knowing something Samantha had only just discovered. Quiet wasn't weakness. A gentle heart wasn't failure. And being overlooked didn't mean you had nothing worth seeing. Samantha carried the box back to the cabin before dark. Over the next several weeks, everything changed. She contacted Samuel Bennett again, but this time she wasn't interested in another appraisal. "I want to preserve it," she told him. "All of it. All of it." Samuel introduced her to archivists and preservation specialists. Samantha contacted a regional historical society and a veterans organization. Together, they began developing a plan to document the collection while keeping it connected to the place where generations of the Reed family had protected it. Samantha could have sold pieces. She could have paid every bill she'd ever worried about. She could have walked away wealthy. Instead, she chose stewardship. Not because money didn't matter. At 39, Samantha understood perfectly well that it did. But she also understood that not everything valuable should be converted into something spendable. Richard hated the decision. Diane called it selfish. The legal questions continued for a while. Then Henry Caldwell produced Evelyn's records, years of inventories, ownership documents, appraisal reports, and handwritten instructions. Evelyn had prepared for this. Of course she had. Winter arrived before the arguments finally quieted. One cold afternoon, Samantha heard a vehicle pull into the clearing. It was Emily, the same cousin who had laughed when Samantha inherited the cabin. Samantha stepped onto the porch. Emily climbed out carrying an old cardboard box. "I found these in Dad's attic," she said. Samantha didn't answer. Emily looked embarrassed. "They were Grandpa's?" She opened the box. Letters. Photographs. A purple heart wrapped carefully in an old handkerchief. Emily looked toward the cabin. I almost threw them away. Her voice broke slightly. Then I heard what you're doing here. She held the box toward Samantha. Maybe they belong with the others. For a moment, neither woman moved. Then Samantha took it. Come inside, she said. That afternoon, they sat beside Evelyn's fireplace and read the letters together. Some made them laugh. One made Emily cry. And for the first time Samantha could remember, they talked about their family without arguing over who deserved what. By the first snowfall, the cabin had begun becoming something Evelyn herself might never have imagined. Not a museum filled with expensive objects behind glass. A place where stories were kept alive. Veterans could bring photographs and letters. Families could identify names that had nearly been forgotten. Young people could sit at the old table and hear what history sounded like when it came from someone who had actually lived it. One evening, Samantha stood on the porch as snow settled across the mountains. Behind her, the cabin windows glowed warm against the darkness. For years, she'd thought coming back to Maple Ridge would mean admitting she'd failed to build a life somewhere else. Now she understood. Sometimes coming home isn't going backward. Sometimes it's how we finally discover what we've been walking toward all along. Samantha smiled and looked toward the old sycamore beyond the trees. Her family had laughed when she inherited a worthless cabin. They stopped laughing when they learned what was beneath the floor. But Samantha no longer cared about proving them wrong. Because the greatest thing she'd found wasn't worth $2 million. It couldn't be appraised at all. She had found a purpose. She had found where she belonged. And she had finally become the woman Evelyn Reed had always known she could be. But Evelyn had left one final letter behind. And when Samantha found it hidden inside the back cover of the ledger, she would finally learn the answer to the question that had followed her from the beginning. Why her? Winter settled quietly over Maple Ridge. One evening, while finishing the last pages of Evelyn's ledger, Samantha discovered a small envelope hidden inside the back cover. On it were 4 words. For the next keeper. Inside was Evelyn's final letter. She wrote that for years. Relatives had asked about the old coins, the land, and what everything might someday be worth. But Samantha had been different. When she was 9, she had once picked up an old photograph of a soldier and asked, "Grandma, who was he?" Not, how much is this worth? But who was he? Evelyn had never forgotten. Then Samantha reached the final lines. I didn't choose you because you were the quietest. I chose you because you listened. Tears filled Samantha's eyes. All her life, she'd mistaken her quiet nature for weakness because others had treated it that way. But the person who knew her best had seen something else. The family had been fascinated by the $2 million secret beneath the cabin floor. Samantha finally understood that Evelyn's greatest gift had never been hidden there. It was knowing that someone she loved had truly seen her all along. And maybe that's worth remembering in our own lives. There may still be an old photograph in your family nobody asks about anymore. A story your mother once told. A memory your father assumes everyone has forgotten. If someone is still here to tell you, ask them, then listen. Because one day, you may have 100 questions and no one left who knows the answers. Samantha looked across the snow-covered mountains and remembered Evelyn's words. The loudest person in the room rarely hears what matters most. Now she finally understood. A true inheritance isn't only what someone leaves to us. It's what they leave inside us. And sometimes, the stories we take time to remember become the most valuable things we leave behind. If this story touched your heart, share in the comments. What story from your family do you never want forgotten? And subscribe for more stories about family, legacy, and the things in life worth remembering.